Okay, well, I guess we can begin. I'm Matt Edmond. I'm with Capital City Development Corporation, which is the urban renewal agency here in Boise. Prior to that, I was with the Ada County Highway District for about 7.5 years. Quick show of hands, who do we have here that works for a transportation agency or road department, something like that? Okay, advocates? Any other people that work in other fields? And what do you do? So I can
Public health.
Public health?
Planning, community development.
Okay. So I'll warn you right now, this isn't some sort of peer-reviewed study or anything like that. It's more my screed on pet peeves. For those kind of big picture items that are missed with sidewalks, primarily in town centers, mixed use areas where you do have a fair amount of foot traffic. So what makes a place walkable? Well, this is Jeff Speck's book on Walkable City, if anyone's read it. He said you need 4 elements. It needs to be useful, it needs to be safe, it needs to be comfortable, it needs to be interesting. I'm going to focus primarily on the comfort, but also touch on the safety and usefulness. I would say to be walkable, someone needs to be able to walk a sidewalk and be able to converse with somebody, maybe look at their phone a little bit, maybe take in the sights, without spending an undue amount of time focusing on obstacles or hazards in and across the sidewalk. Bottom line, a sidewalk is a civic space, and it shouldn't be subordinated to motoring in a town center environment especially. So real quick primer on sidewalks. You may have seen this before. You have the edge zone or the clear zone. That's the space immediately behind the curb. You may have car doors opening there and diagonal parking. You may have the bumper hanging over. It's the edge of where you put traffic control signs. Then you have the buffer or furnishing zone. It's where all your street furniture should go. Your trees, your light posts, your trash cans, your mailboxes and whatnot. Beyond that is a throughway zone. Nothing should go there but where people walk. And then you have the frontage zone. This is courtesy of the Ontario Ministry of Transportation. We do have, this is from the Ada County Highway District, Livable Streets Design Guide. So more or less, nomenclature is slightly different, but more or less the same thing. This may look familiar to some of the people in our audience. I would like to point out though, I love this. Colors do not indicate color-based surface treatments. So, Director of Engineering at Highway District, back in the time, they were doing some colored concrete. He really didn't like it, and he thought that was the most important thing to point out in this illustration. And if your Chief of Engineering is most concerned with that, you may run into some difficulties in building some walkable sidewalks. So what are the big missteps with walkability? First of all, and I think this picture shows it pretty well, misalignment. You shouldn't be misaligning the walking path unless absolutely necessary. With the notable exception of roundabouts, motorists are not asked to go out of direction when they travel through an intersection. And so we should strive for the similar directness of route with pedestrians. Insufficient width. This is, a lot of times we go with narrow sidewalks, but a lot of times this is caused, the first 2 things are really caused by obstacles that are placed in the throughway path. And then lastly, excess conflict areas. And these are primarily intersections, crossing intersections, but also driveways due to their number, their width, and their type. So, anyone tell me what's wrong with this picture?
Crosswalk.
This is the corner, yeah, this is the corner right out here in front of the Capitol. You can see the crosswalk doesn't line up with the ADA ramp, which doesn't light up the sidewalk. The ADA ramp is blocked by the handicap parking space there. In the defense of the Highway District, I believe this was in the middle of the 2-way conversion, so they hadn't restriped or anything. This condition has largely been fixed, although the ramp doesn't quite line up with the sidewalk still. So here's a dog-legged sidewalk, and I believe it was because the Transportation Department didn't want trucks to slow down to yield to pedestrians so they could get off a 5-lane facility. I've never seen a tractor trailer drive in here during rush hour or anywhere midday really. They come in at night, so I don't see why this was an issue, but for some reason pedestrians had to be inconvenienced by it. And this sees a fair amount of foot traffic. It's over by the courthouse. Here's a crosswalk that doesn't line up with the sidewalk. Doesn't line up with the sidewalk on 11th Street. This is 11th and Myrtle in downtown. Doesn't align with the ramp. Sure doesn't align with the pathway there. In defense of the State Highway Agency, ITD, these ramps were put in, and the crosswalk hasn't been restriped, but it has been 6 months since those ramps were put in, so I would say the grace period may have lapsed there. Here you've got a curb ramp that points you right into a building face. So you really want those ramps to line up with your throughway zones. Again, we should strive for directness of travel, especially with people that have mobility and sight impairments. Here's a crosswalk that's out of alignment with the sidewalk. Sidewalk width. So that's enough of the misalignments. I'll talk about widths now. So without debating it too much, two people should be able to walk abreast without squeezing next to each other along a sidewalk. It should be at least that wide. Where we tend to see width issues for the most part is the crosswalks. We'll narrow the crosswalks down, and that's a really unusual thing. It's a strange thing to me that we would do that. Again, we wouldn't do it with vehicle lanes going through an intersection, so I don't know why we do it with crosswalks, especially when you have a few seconds to walk and then it's flashing at you don't walk and you get 3.5 feet per second to cross a crosswalk. If you got a lot of people, you don't want to be squeezing in on a tight crosswalk. Something like that would be better. And per state code, the crosswalk is defined as wide as the sidewalks it connects on the either side of the highway. So I don't know why we're going with narrower crosswalks there. Here's a good crosswalk width. You see how it lines up with the sidewalk from the curb all the way to the building face on the other side. If you don't have enough paint to do this continental, you could do traverse. But again, if we're in a town center area, we're expecting a lot of foot traffic, we should be marking those crosswalks full width with the sidewalks. Now this picture I had to find online. The Highway District, to its credit, has been pretty good about fixing the ones of these that did exist years ago. Remember, there used to be one on Amco at State, right in the middle of the ped ramp. But I'd like to talk more about the obstacles created by accessibility here. So here's an ADA ramp. You see where it got painted yellow? We don't generally paint yellow. They put a vertical curb in there because they couldn't meet the 12-to-1 slope for a flare before that pole. So, solution to a vertical curb. Well, it ends up being a tripping hazard. And so they had to paint it yellow. Had to put reflectors on this one so people would trip it. And I don't know if you can see it. Has anyone seen the stencils on the ramps downtown, wheels down zone? So we've created enough of a terrain park with these curbs downtown that we have to stencil the ramps, hey, this isn't a skateboard park. Because we've sent plenty of cues that maybe it is. So bottom line is, don't put curbs in the middle of your sidewalk. Put them between the sidewalk and the street. Put them behind the sidewalk if necessary. If you do have some sort of bioretention plan or something there, like that, you have curbs there obviously. But don't put curbs in the middle of the sidewalk. I'm sure this is a prime candidate to get paint or reflectors in the near future. Here's more curbs in the sidewalk. So there are guidelines on this. So you basically want to use flares on your curbs. If you can't meet the slopes for those flares, curbs aren't the right answer. You can see you can use curbs if they're protected from cross travel by landscaping, street furniture, chains, fencing, or railings. I don't think the planter strip quite covers this, because that's part of the pedestrian zone. Okay, next, APS poles. So we've been putting in ramps for 30 years now, and we still seem to be struggling with it. So it's no surprise that the APS push-button poles, which are relatively new to most, are a challenge as well.
Can you define APS?
Oh, thank you. Accessible pedestrian signal. So this is where you push the button, and it doesn't necessarily make the walk sign go on. That could go on irregardless, but regardless. but it will give you the tone and the vibration to cue you that it's safe to cross if you're visibly impaired. So there's your throughway zone between the furnishing zone and the frontage zone. Should be clear of obstacles. We have a pole there. We also have one of those nice vertical curbs. So what are the APS standards? Is everyone familiar with them? Anyone not? So you have poles to cross at a standard four-way intersection. You'd have a push button at either of the two crosswalks. They should be a minimum of 10 feet apart. They should be 30 inches to 120 inches back from the curb on a level landing, so they can't be in the ramp area. No higher than 42 inches, so someone above the landing, so someone in a wheelchair can reach them. So, you know, it's hard to get them out of the throughway zone under a standard geometry. Here's an ideal placement, and the wide buffers here kind of help you. You've got your crosswalk lining up really nice with your ramp, and your sidewalk thereafter, and you can see the poles are on the edge of it. And this is 3rd and Main, so it's your ideal placement. What would you do with something like this? This is the record exchange. And you can see those poles. On either sidewalk, they're basically in the middle of the throughway zone. This is a challenge with the width of the sidewalk there. And you can't always do something about it, but in an area with high foot traffic like this gets a lot of foot traffic during the daytime, on weekends. There's a Neurolux right there. You should probably invest in a little bit better solution. So how about bulb outs? So this is a corner by City Hall at 6th and Main. And granted, this doesn't have APS push buttons, but if it did, that's where they'd go per the standard, 10 feet apart on the landing right behind the ramp. And there's your throughway zones. So it doesn't interfere with them. That bulb out can get you that extra few feet to clear your throughway zone. Pioneer Pathway. Has anyone used Pioneer Pathway before? Anyone local that rides it to or from 11th? Okay, so this thing was built back in 2009, I want to say. Was part of a TAP grant. Great pathway. It's 14 to 15 feet wide. However, trouble comes into paradise, or it used to, when you got up to the 11th and Myrtle intersection. It necks down to a sidewalk that I think is 6 feet. However, due to the curb radius and the single ramp there and the skew of the intersection, it caused a lot of out-of-direction travel. And it's a multi-use pathway, connects to the Greenbelt, lots of bikes on it. Really hard to do. Here's a street view of it. You can see the crosswalk there. Lines up with the ramp, but it doesn't line up with the sidewalk on 11th or the sidewalk really along Myrtle, and it sure doesn't line up with the pathway there. Here's a closer view. Here's a gentleman with, it appears to be a little bit of an impairment. He's got a cane, trying to figure out how to get through that intersection. And here you can really see the dog leg. You see that choke point. So what do? ITD was working on a project to resurface Front and Myrtle, and they agreed to rebuild those ramps if we widen up the pathway. So we widened it up. ITD straightened out the ramp, straightened out this ramp a bit. Yeah.
Use that screen.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So we widened the pathway, so it's about 17, 18 feet here. So you've got a straight connection from Myrtle to the east, and a fairly straight connection from 11th to the north for bikes or pedestrians. And here's after. The crosswalk hasn't been repainted yet, but if it was, it'd be something like that. And so we can't get ideal alignment with the crosswalk and both the 11th Street sidewalk and the pathway, but I think we got the best of both worlds there. You know, a good balance.
Matt, do you know if the other ramps issue have been resolved because they're not the width of the pathway?
So this ramp here isn't the width of the pathway either. The pathway is about 15 feet, and per the AASHTO guidelines, it's supposed to be as wide as the pathway. It is 8 feet, which I think is a good compromise. You know, 4 feet I think would be way too narrow, but I think 8 feet is sufficient for the mixed traffic you would see. It did take a lot of back and forth to get that.
Okay, so it's more about the Gardner and the jump corners that are brand new that didn't have.
Still working on that. Still working on that.
So did you widen the pathway on the other side of the sidewalk?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's hard to, I should have got a better picture. But so all this here, that's benches, that's a couple of new river birch trees. So this is the old pathway, how it would taper. The new pathway basically goes there. So you've got the concrete, between the concrete and the pavers, that pathway is over 20 feet wide now at the intersection.
Did you acquire property from that property owner, or how did you?
We actually had an easement from when the pathway was first built. Even without the easement, the property owner was agreeable. We would have needed to get an easement to spend, the public funding there, but it saves him on landscape maintenance. So, yeah, it's a good question. The ITD's right of way actually, I don't think even covers. I think it barely covers the sidewalk. So, next one's conflict areas, and this is a really big one. If you can't reduce the number of lanes or narrow your lanes down, generally the next best thing you have to work with is reducing your curb radii. So this is from the NACTO Urban Street Design Guide. You can see narrowing that radius from 25 feet to 10 feet on the corners. That reduces your crossing distance by 9 feet. NACTO recommends not going larger than 15 feet in an urban area. And if you have anything like street parking or bike lanes, those can increase your effective curb radius, by 5 feet for bike lanes, 10 feet for parking. So you generally don't need a 25 or 30 foot curb radius. So here's another one we did with ITD. This is 9th in front of the Boise Center. These corners all had 30 foot curb radii, which is, I think the ITD standard is 28 or maybe it's 30. Anyway, because of the one-way configuration here, Front Street's going one-way westbound and 9th Street's going one-way southbound, you can't turn across this corner, so there's no point in a 30-foot curb radius. So you can see before, you can see after. And that's basically what we got. It doesn't look like much. It's about 170 square feet of additional sidewalk there. It reduced the crossing of 9th Street by, I believe, 11 feet because of the way the ramp was done, and a good 5 feet on Front Street. And that adds up if you're doing, it makes a shorter distance for people to cross who have mobility impairments. And potentially, it can change your cycle lengths because you need less time to allow them to cross and still meet a standard. We got about 20 of these. Only 2 were this big, but we got about 20 corners tightened up with a cooperative agreement with ITD. So, show of hands, who thinks we need to get bikes off the sidewalks? Yeah? Not too many? Not too many? Okay.
Let's get the dockless cars off the sidewalk.
So, exactly, that's the one thing that's always a forehead slapper for me is we talk about bikes on the sidewalks, we never talk about cars on the sidewalks. Every single driveway is a car driving across the sidewalk. So that's kind of a canard. Until such time as we can eliminate cars and trucks or provide enough on-street parking for them, certainly we're going to need driveways, but we need to think very seriously about when and where they go. They create a lot of problems, especially in an urban environment. They invite cars into the pedestrian space. They confuse what's sidewalk and what's street. They obviously increase the potential for conflicts. They really disrupt the sidewalk and streetscape pattern. And they reduce the availability of on-street parking for private parking. And where curb cut driveways are bad, does everyone know the difference between a curb cut and a curb return driveway? Because curb return driveways are worse. Driveways are basically holes in your sidewalk. So
what's the curb return?
I'll show you one sec. I've got a slide on that. But here, does this look like a useful, safe, comfortable, or interesting place to walk? It's basically just a block of driveways. I will give it to them that they got 3 street trees shoehorned into the pole position here. And that, in their defense, this was built, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago. This was built 2 years ago. And it's nothing but driveways and metal garage gates. Doesn't look like much of a place to walk. Here is the the former Owyhee Hotel, now the Owyhee Plaza and Flats. I took a picture here because this is the old porte cochere, so this was a driveway entrance into the hotel. They closed it out. They've got planter boxes there. So this whole block face now, the whole block face on Main between 11th and 12th, not a single driveway cut. It's a really nice place to walk. It looks out over a parking lot and the Imperial Plaza garage entrance there, dominated by driveways. So which side of the street would you walk on? So we want to manage the number and the width of driveways. We also want to manage the type. So on the left you have a curb cut driveway, and the right a curb return. Curb return driveways are great for getting traffic off of high-speed corridors, high volumes of traffic off of high-speed corridors, at decent speeds without a lot of delay to the throughway. They're really inappropriate in a town center environment, anywhere where you want to encourage walking. We'll do a little quiz. Is this a sidewalk or a street? You get a lot of cues that it's a sidewalk. It's at the sidewalk grade, it's consistent width, it's consistent material. I think, and that is a driveway, but I think cars driving across that probably know it's a sidewalk. What about this one? Same thing, right? The only difference is it's brick rather than concrete, but it is a distinct material from the roadway surface. How about this one? Sidewalk grade drops down, the width is different. At least it's a consistent material with the sidewalk, different from the street. And this just loses on all counts. I mean, it looks like a street to me. Other thing about the curb return driveways is they're generally at lower grades. There's not a big grade difference from the street. So you have cars driving across the sidewalk at higher speeds. And curb return, you have curb radii. And the bigger the radii, the faster that car can drive across your sidewalk. Another thing is, we talked about this earlier with the ADA ramps, they introduce trip hazards on your sidewalk. So you get cars with almost zero impediment driving across your sidewalk while you've got impediments to pedestrians on your sidewalk. So I talked about how driveways disrupt your streetscape, and I want to show you that. A little case study, curb cut versus a curb return. This is Broad Street between 6th and Capitol. This is the new Marriott Hotel on the right. It was just built last year, and this is a two-way alley now. It serves to access that hotel, so it's 20 feet wide. The gap between the trees is 52 feet, which really isn't a lot because our trees are spaced on about 30 feet on center, so you're only losing 22 feet of tree space there. Parking gaps, very little, 32 feet, and your average parking stall is 20 to 25 feet long. Let's look right across the street. So there, I am now standing in that old curb cut driveway, looking across the street at this curb return driveway. It's 40 feet wide at the narrowest part, 60 feet wide at the ramps. Parking gap is almost 100 feet. That's 4 parking spaces. That's 4 on-street parking stalls could have been installed there. But that's not even as big as the gap between street trees, 120 feet. You lost 3 street trees there. So what's the real cost of that, though? So you lost some street trees and some street parking. Doesn't matter. What's the value of street parking? Anybody know? Other than the revenue that the city obviously gets and the mayor makes his millions off of? Creates a buffer. Creates a buffer for your sidewalks. It calms your street traffic. It's flexible parking. It can be used. It's not it decreases your reliance on single-use parking. Employees can park there in lower demand areas. Your customers can park there. People who are just running quick errands can park there. Residents can park there. It's useful.
Trader Joe's with tight parking, getting 2 more spaces on the street with a narrower entry would seem to help that.
So Trader Joe's that's where that curb return was, and I love Trader Joe's. I go there. You ask my coworkers, I go there probably 3 or 4 times a week. to get some junk food and bring back to the office. But that's a difficult spot. They need to bring tractor trailers in, and there's not really a good place to bring those. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But street parking does have a value. It makes for a walkable street. It helps make for a walkable street. How about street trees? What are they worth? They also do a lot of the same things. They cool off the sidewalk. They create traffic calming. They give you a street pattern. They frame it. This study here said the average street tree in Boise is worth about $43 a year. So every driveway that disrupts those street trees, you're imposing a social cost. So I think we need to think about that. I'm not saying get rid of all driveways, but every driveway we put in, we should think about it. So first thing I want you to take away is, unless you live in a community or have sidewalks that don't have light poles or street trees or parking meters or on-street trash collection or bike racks or power poles or businesses with sandwich board signs or traffic control or parking meters or mail delivery or free and fair elections, you need a furnishing zone.
Or snow plowing.
Or snow plowing, certainly. You need a furnishing zone. We seem to disregard it. It needs to be probably at an absolute minimum 3 feet. Generally, if you've got a lot of this stuff going on, probably closer to 6 feet. Next, leverage your maintenance projects. I talked about Pioneer Pathway and those reduced curb radii. We got that in a cooperative agreement with ITD. So identify those projects. You can do it through your MPOs, Regional Transportation Improvement Plans. Find out what those are. Check the ITD site, your local highway district or streets department, see what their budget or their work plan is. Identify those projects and identify the issues in those project limits. If there's anything, hey, this is a real problem, can we get this fixed? Because a lot of times you can get these done and the costs are incidental or pretty small as part of a larger maintenance project.
I'll just jump in real quick.
Yeah.
When I was working for ITD when that came in, and just as a heads up, it really helps to make that connection with your highway department early. So I know that they don't really do a lot of outreach until it's coming up to construction, but at that point, the project's already been designed and they've expended their budget, they've stamped their plans. And I remember when Roger was designing that, having to go through all this back and forth after the project was already kind of considered done. And the same thing on Shinden. They came out with like a walk bike study on Shinden after PS&E, after the plans were done. And they were able to get a lot incorporated, but it cost a lot more money and ended up doing change orders and construction. So the best thing you can do is look at the ITIP, look at what's coming up 5 years from now, so that you're making that connection. You have a lot more success in getting those things incorporated if you reach out 5, 4, 3 years in advance, not just the summer before construction can happen. And ITD is not great at reaching out. It's your job, if you want to be able to do this, to pay attention to your MPO and look at what's coming in your community and reach out to ITD if you want to be more successful.
Thank you for making my third point, because we had to pay for a lot of redesign on those fixes we got along Front and Myrtle. Act ASAP. Because a lot of these get designed several years before construction, and design does cost money. In ITD's defense, you say they don't do good outreach. They can't be mind readers, and they can't intimately know every single road and sidewalk and street corner along all these hundreds of miles of roadway they have. So,
and I did planning and programming. We have no funding stream for pedestrian facilities. I say we. I don't work for ITD anymore. They have no funding stream for pedestrians and bicycles, so it is not a priority. It's not something that obvious comes up when you're doing your design. So if you don't tell them that you have a plan for bike and peds in your community, then they're not gonna know, and they won't include it in their design. So, and it might be something where you do some kind of non-participating funding to help with the federal funds. If you can come up with some city funds to do the, sidewalk redo, like they did along Front and Myrtle. ITD doesn't necessarily have a dedicated funding, but if you can do some kind of like minimal where you get to take advantage of their contractors being out, and you don't have to pay to have someone come out there and do the mobility and mobilization for the contractor. You could do some kind of partnership, and those are types of things that won't happen unless you look, a couple years out.
Also, I worked with Amanda. At that time for your project, we were dealing with the after effects of the surplus eliminator. We had so many projects at that time that really we were overwhelmed. And so when you have this extra, as I said, extra reach out, that hopefully at other times maybe we have fewer projects, we're able to do that more effectively, but
Yeah.
it's just the timing
Yeah.
there that.
Again, it goes to the third bullet. I'm not saying we did it right. Check that, check the ITIP early and often. With regard to the funding for the sidewalks, most of those 20 corners that we got done, they needed to do ADA compliance anyway. So the cost of changing the corner radii would have been largely incidental. There were a few that the ramps were already compliant, so we had to pay for the full cost of rebuild. But you can leverage that, even with the ITD projects, and certainly with your local highway districts and street departments. So once you're done leveraging your maintenance projects, and use advisory committees. It may be tough to talk an engineer into something, but if your local street department or highway district or something, ACHD's got an ADA advisory committee. They have a walking and biking advisory committee. Use them. Let them be your advocate to the agency. Leverage private development. So this goes with sidewalks, managing the driveways, getting pathways. I have Jump Simplot up here. They're putting the Pioneer Pathway up through their development. It's probably somewhere between 700 and 1,000 feet long new pathway. I think the driveways here are pretty good. They're all curb cut driveways and they're fairly well consolidated. Have some design standards for it. A lot of times talk to the developer about it and they will be helpful in doing things. I mean, generally they want to manage their costs, but they do want to foster goodwill. So what you can't get through design review or through the development process, maybe you can negotiate with them in good faith. Manage your ramps and poles. So use flares on your ramps. Only use curbs where it's protected from cross traffic. There's landscaping behind the curb or you've got some sort of physical barrier. Use bulb outs in high traffic areas to get those APS poles outside of your throughway zone and on the edge of the furnishing zone. Consider blended ramps or wider throats. Wider throats in places where you expect mixed traffic, where you have a multi-use pathway and you have bikes there, or really, really high traffic. Or if you've got an odd geometry, I know we like to go with these directional ramps almost to a fault. But if you have a weird geometry, and that's one of the things Don was asking about, the opposite corner of 11th and Myrtle is really challenged because it's at an acute angle. And they tried to put directional ramps in and they're not going to work. And so a blended ramp is probably the answer there. So consider those. They're not always appropriate, but they might be.
The value of the directional ramp is really for a sight-impaired person. It gets them going the right way. At least my sight-impaired friends have told me that they really value that.
I understand that. However, if it's imposing significant out of direction, I'm guessing you're at a point of diminishing returns.
I'm not trying to say there are times you don't use them. I'm just saying if you start by understanding that they have value, then when you deviate, it's because there was a significant reason. It's not, oh yeah, well, yes, but I agree. I think we're on the same page.
Okay. So did anybody go to Darren Fluke's Transportation Action Plan yesterday? Remember him talking about park once? So it's really important to walkable sidewalks, park once. So, and what that basically is, first of all, manage your street parking. If you have street parking, if you're gonna have street parking, get it used, because if you design your street, so that it's supposed to have parking on both sides, but it never gets used, That's 15 to 20 feet of extra street width that just imposes speeding or induces speeding. So get it used. You want it at least half used, at least 50% full, when your businesses are open during the day. If it don't let it get too full though. If Don Shoup says basically 85%, if your parking is more than 85% full, you've probably got it underpriced, or you don't have it managed with some sort of time limit or something. So get it full. Get it full. You can see the picture here. This is street parking, but it's actually a delivery zone from 6 to 10 a.m. So designate your delivery zones. Like I said with Trader Joe's, their tractor trailers need to come in onto the lot to service Trader Joe's, and so they need a wider driveway. Maybe they even need a curb return driveway. There's not really a good place to do the on-street delivery there. But a lot of other places downtown do. What's that?
If you quit buying all that junk.
That's true. Yeah.
Organic junk.
Yes, exactly. It's organic, fair trade junk food. So designate delivery zones and times. We don't need to do off-street loading and delivery with our businesses. You can do that on street if you manage your curbside space. Eliminate your off-street parking requirements. Because all those do is create single-use parking. The vast majority of it, which is underutilized most of the time, and it just creates more driveways. Once you do that, you can consolidate your off-street parking. You can consolidate your driveways. And please, put curb return driveways in as an absolute last resort in your town center areas. Where you've got high-speed thoroughfares, you may need them. In a town center area, they're absolutely inappropriate. And that's all I have. I'll stand for any questions.
So I didn't go to the transportation workshop, and I'm trying to process the last thing you just said, to either eliminate or consolidate your off-street parking. Doesn't that then create parking garages that are bad for sidewalks? How do you deal with parking garages that are?
I love parking garages. I think parking garages are great.
Showed parking garages that had tons of driveways.
So, yeah, there is a right way to do parking garages.
What is the right way?
So I think if you look at the 9th and Main, the Capitol and Main parking garages down here on either side of 8th Street, I think they're really well done. They have retail wraps. They have ground floor storefront space on them. So other than the garage entrance, you don't really know, or looking up, you don't know a garage is there. There are other garages that certainly, could be better, probably the one by Boise Plaza. If it's just a parking garage at the ground level, it's just a blank wall.
So what you're saying is that exit or entrance should be set back farther? I'm not picturing it.
So with a parking garage, you have a very limited number of exits and entrances, right? That's the first thing. But the rest of the space it's activated. You've got ground floor retail or something. It's not just one big blank wall. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's called a retail wrap. I think that's the way you do it.
I guess.
So I'm not saying eliminate all off-street parking. I'm saying eliminate the requirements, because generally and you may want to even put in limits at some point. The off-street parking requirements, if you've got a fine grain of parcels, they're going to be extremely inefficient in trying to meet those parking requirements. A parking garage is as unfun as those may be, as places to be, they're very efficient at parking cars, per square foot of space. You could have a consolidated surface lot somewhere, but your off-street parking requirements, there's no such thing as free parking. You're paying for it somehow. With an off-street parking requirement, all that basically does is make sure that everybody's paying for your parking rather than just the person who's using it. Mark, do you have something?
Just a quick question. Last year or two, you had 4 major hotels come in, and having seen some of the plans, they have a lot of parking with those. Not that you'll necessarily notice that from street level. Did you have any feedback on how I guess those are supposedly mostly just for the patrons. Any feedback from your point of view on how well they've done with their parking and not having their parking stand out as being an obvious blank wall, or maybe they are, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think retail wraps are best. You want some sort of activated use, whether it's a coffee shop or something like that, so it's an interesting place to walk by. With the parking garages themselves, if you can really limit the access points and make them look like sidewalks, don't do curb returns. I'm a strong believer the more you have consolidated parking, the better. That way you can, as certain demands go up, you've got your office workers are 8 to 5, your hotel patrons, the ones that do drive, are probably not coinciding that, they're more in the evening. Your bar and restaurant patrons are coming at other times. If you have a bunch of different off-street, single uses and off-street requirements for them, you've got most of your parking empty most of the time. So it's really inefficient and it spaces things out. It makes it hard to walk. You're walking further and you're walking across a lot of driveways to do it. And at some point, people just, well, I'm just going to get in my car and drive that 2 blocks. So, yeah, the parking garages, they're not the ideal best use, but we have to do something. We have to store the car somewhere. We're not going to a car-free society tomorrow. Yes?
You mentioned most of these treatments are for the urban core, and you have a special urban core most of us don't have. If you were to start in another area,
Mm-hmm.
could you pick one thing you would start with, maybe 2, where you would put your focus on?
I don't think this needs to be, I don't think this applies just to the Boise downtown urban core. I think it applies anywhere, even a small town center. You've got a main street, manage the parking on it. I think all these things apply. Maybe you don't put meters in, but the first thing you want to do is you get people parking on it until your parking fills up. And then at that point, okay, we need to look at some sort of management. 1 hour, 2 hour limited parking, something like that. I'm not saying you need to put in meters in garages everywhere. But the last thing you want for your main street is for every 50 feet to have a driveway and then 50 to 100 feet deep in the lot of parking. I mean, that's the last thing you want. So get rid of that. Use your street parking first, and then figure out, some sort of consolidated off-street parking as you get there. Does that make sense?
Just to build off that real quick, from the standpoint of when I started the community I worked at, we were 15,000, we're now up to 35,000. Having sidewalks aligned, not utilizing curb return driveways, all of that is paying dividends now that we're up at 35,000. We're not dealing with those issues. So I'm seeing this saying, oh, we were doing some things right. I'm also seeing some things that we need to continue doing for future as we continue to grow. But the sooner you do it, the less problems smaller communities are going to have in the long run.
I think it's one, it sets an expectation, and sometimes it's the first time getting it right is the hardest. Elected officials or somebody, the first time they make that call is the hardest, but after that either the word gets around or you have an example to show people of how it's working, and that helps breed more success.
In Driggs, Idaho, we have a town of less than 2,000 people. We've adopted design standards that requires new development to consolidate driveways, to provide a cross-access agreement with adjacent property owners. And we have a shared use parking ordinance where they can, based on a table that we have in different mixes of uses, they can calculate a lower parking requirement. And then we have parking maximums as well. So small towns can do this stuff, and it does pay off.
Exactly, yeah. Molly?
2 points I'll try to make really quickly. One is I'm from Sandpoint, and downtown we had a problem with the employees taking all the on-street parking. The enforcement has gotten much stricter, and we've now provided free 24-hour parking a little bit away, and that does attract employees. second, I used to live in Portland, and in the 1970s, the city council said, we want 70% of employees to not arrive in their own vehicle. And they worked with the bus company, they limited parking. You'll see huge high-rises with very little parking. And there's now light rail, they have carpool parking. An astonishing number of people arrive by bike. You can see them walking across the bridges to downtown. You don't have to accommodate vehicles for everybody downtown if you really provide attractive, safe alternatives.
That's good. Touching on that real quick, so we manage 6.5 garages downtown, and so I deal with parking a lot, and I'd say that we have an adage on it. Parking can be, it's kind of like a contractor can be good, cheap, and fast, you know, 2 of those 3, but not all 3. So with parking, it can be convenient, it can be cheap or free, and it can be available. It can't be all 3 at once. So you want to balance those, like you said with the meter parking. You really want the meter parking short term and more for your patrons, not for your workers. So it's going to be the convenient parking, and it's going to be, you want to make it available. It's not necessarily going to follow that it's going to be cheap or free, and you want to get that more abundant, cheaper, free parking further out for your employees and your you know, people who are going to be there longer term. And I think you had a...
Yeah, I have a question regarding bicycles. So you brought up the slide about
Oh.
whether we should have bikes or on sidewalks or not. And then
Sorry for that head fake.
I'm interested in your thoughts on that. And secondly, the selection of the bike staples, maybe in the picture in the background, where to put those in a downtown area. I don't see a lot of bikes chained to trees here in downtown Boise, so I'm kind of curious where they found some of the successes on that.
Sure. So we do a lot of the bike parking too. And if somebody wants bike parking downtown, give me a call and I'll see where I can squeeze it in. Generally the staples, so if our furnishing zone is much narrower than 6 feet, I'll put it parallel to the curb and try to get it out of that door zone there. Just not that you're there, you know, not that there's a fear of getting doored on your bike, you know, when you're parking it, but it's kind of a pain for the people getting in and out of cars. So parallel to the curb if it's less than 6 feet. If I've got 6 feet or more in the furnishing zone, I'll put them perpendicular to get more space. And generally 32 to 36 inches on center. We've put in, not counting capital projects, big sidewalk projects like the City Hall renovation or something, I've put in probably 40, enough parking for 40 bikes this year so far. Enough for, well, actually more than that even. A bunch in front of the Clearwater building for the Boise State students, some down on the gym block. But just trying to, if you have a business improvement district, that's probably a good source of funding. And that's another thing. If you are charging for parking through meters or a consolidated lot or something, you want to reinvest that money in the area. That's one good use for it, is to put in bike racks on request. Maybe a business improvement district can manage that, if not the city. Certainly an urban renewal agency can. We just, you know, try to look where bikes are locked up to trees on a regular day with good weather and put bike racks in there, basically. So
I'm from Sandpoint as well. I think
Yeah.
I probably showed Molly my photo that I have, but I have one where there's a decorative bike rack on one corner, kind of a small mini pedestrian bowl. There's some staples in the background, all unused, and the bikes are chained up to the trees and a signpost in front of a exercise studio. So, you know, the question is,
how much
far?
closer are they?
20 to 25 feet.
Really, that's
the
all?
funny thing. You'll ride the bike into town, but you won't walk to the exercise, you know, the yoga studio.
Yeah.
So that I was curious if there was a process you go through in selecting, you know, those locations where they get used, or, you know.
So what I'll do is midweek, mid-afternoon, midweek, you know, where the weather's fairly good, I'll walk around and try to find those places where there's more bikes than bike racks. But that's not a unique struggle. I put in 19 staples in front of the Clearwater building for Boise State, and there's still one bike that keeps locking to a tree there. even if all those bike racks full, there's another, dozen or so right across the street. So at some point, maybe you just need to invest in tree guards.
Well, it's just odd,
Yeah.
I live in a real small city, but at our city hall, we have a little bike rack, and people will chain their bike up on the other side at the walk entry. I mean,
Yeah.
they won't even use the bike rack, they just chain it up at the entrance to the post offices.
Yeah, you can only make them as convenient as possible, but at some point, you gotta say uncle.
So what do you think about bikes on the sidewalks?
I believe the police have an agreement with Jimmy John's here where Jimmy John's is only supposed to ride on the sidewalk for the last block, which seems reasonable. I mean, that's basically what we're doing with cars, right? That last segment, you can drive on the sidewalk to get to the parking lot. So, at your destination block, maybe. I don't know. Until we have better bike lanes, it's hard to say to get them all off. So we are at time if anyone needs to leave and do something before the next thing.